As promised, we continue to take a look at the games of the great Jose Raul Capablanca, the chess machine, as he was known as at that point. He has a reputation of being invincible. The reason for that is not only did he win positions where he's already winning and positions which are equal, but also positions and endgames which were slightly inferior. For example, this one. He's clearly inferior here. So this was Duras versus Capablanca. Capablanca is black in this position. As you can see, Capablanca's rook in the corner is attacked. His pawn is weak. If the rook moves, the pawn will drop off. White has got a queenside majority, which is generally better than a kingside majority, which black has, because whenever the black will push his kingside majority, his king will be exposed, and that is the reason white is obviously slightly better here. He has a better chance of creating a passed pawn as compared to black, but this is where you see the genius of Capablanca. He realizes that he's worse, and then he tries to basically he knows which pieces he wants on the board and which pieces he doesn't want. Having queens on the board will only create problems because he has targets like a6. As we have seen, this pawn is attacked, the rook is attacked, and this the white queen can cause trouble. So one of the important things is understanding which pieces to have and which pieces to eliminate. So queen to e4 is black's first move. Capablanca played queen e4. Exchanging queens is actually slightly favorable for black because this releases the tension, and now you can see a lot of plans. White has some excellent plans with rook to d7, knight to e5, b4, and white is still better in this position. So again, it's Capablanca to move. I mean, it's white to move. White played b4 here. But again, if you look at this position, how are we going to win this one? It's very difficult. So b4 played, which is slightly an inaccuracy. Better was rook to d7 followed by knight e5, putting pressure on the f7 pawn, and just in general controlling the 7th rank is a good idea. But b4, and now things are not so bad for black. Here he plays knight to c3. So let's take a look at a few moves. It's obviously a double attack. We're attacking the rook and we're also attacking the pawn. Basically, white will drop a pawn. So let's see what happens if he plays something like rook to a1. In this position, we can simply play rook to b8, put a lot of pressure on these pawns, and as you can see, one of the pawns will drop off. Going back in this position, if you play something like rook to c1 in order to attack the knight, here we have a surprise, knight to e2, and that will be a fork. So again, going back, the only correct move for him is to play rook to d3, which happened in the game, and basically just to give up the pawn. So black takes the pawn, white now plays rook to a3, knight to b6 is actually a good move. It protects the rook. Basically, white's plan of pushing forward with b5 is not going to work because we can simply capture back and the rook in the corner is protected, at least for now. So white now brings his knight in the game. And again, you can pause the video and try to find how are you going to continue this the game from here on. Again, it's not very brilliant move, but these little moves are very important. These little positional moves determine the entire game in the long run. So black in the game played king to f8, and this is a very good move. Capablanca obviously utilizes all of his pieces. The same is done by Carlsen or Fischer. Fischer did the same. He always used all of his pieces. Karpov always used all of his pieces. And Magnus, obviously, today he's the greatest player. He's known as the strongest player today, and he uses all of his pieces whenever he's trying to play, specifically in endgames. So the knight is in the game, the rook is in the game, and black's king is much closer to the center as compared to white's king. So that is already a good thing. So let's continue. White now played knight to d3. The threat is very clear. He wants to play knight to c5 followed by attacking this, and maybe the pawn can drop off. So how will you continue here? Would you defend it passively or would you go ahead and attack it? Capablanca realizes it's time to play actively and played knight to d5, attacking white's pawn. So basically, there is going to be a trade of slaves. This is known as exchange of slaves. This is a weak pawn. This is a weak pawn. Both of them will exchange these pawns, and at the end, it is black Capablanca who will be a pawn up. So when we started this game, Capablanca was in a slightly inferior position, and now he's already equal, and maybe he can switch things apart. So let's see. Now here we go. Rook to a4, rook to b8, giving up the pawn on a6. For the pawn on b4, he realizes that going into this endgame will give him better chances. So rook takes, knight takes. Here we go. We have exchange of the knights, and this is the position we are going to look at in detail. So what has Capablanca achieved? Well, he was worse and now he's clearly doing much better. He has extra pawn, obviously. The pawn on e6, the e pawn is an extra pawn. And in general, although this is technically a drawish endgame, it's not drawn. Yes, it's known to be a drawish endgame, but doesn't mean that it's dead draw. In fact, there's a lot of play here, there's a lot of move here, and there is no need to assume that this is a draw. In fact, if Carlsen and Fabiano or some other players are playing this, they can agree draw because they trust their techniques. But otherwise, if you're playing on a lesser level than the top elites, then you can continue and keep playing, keep pushing in this position. So what does white want here? What does black want here? This is very important to understand. Whenever you're in a worse position, you want to exchange pieces. So in this position, white wants to exchange all of his three pawns, and that will give him the best chances of making a draw. Whereas black doesn't want to exchange more amount of pieces, more amount of pawns. What he wants is to suppress these pawns. He wants to push back white and just dominate him position. So get a space advantage basically is what he wants. So let's see what happens. Now, rook to a7 played. It's actually a good move, taking control of the 7th rank and making it difficult for black to get his king up the board. Now, what does white want here? What does white want to play here? White would very much like to play g4 and take control of the f5 and h5 square. And in case we played f5, he can just exchange, and that would actually be good for white because he would have got one pair of pawns exchanged. So we need to, now we already know what white wants. He wants to play g4, so we need to avoid it. We need to play h5. That's what played that was played in the game. So we are stopping g4 and we are threatening to push forward with h4, just dominating these pawns. These two pawns are being dominated, so that's quite an interesting move already. What are we doing? Okay, that was not the move that was played. Okay, so white in this position played g3. Now, again, you need to ask yourself, what does white want here? White would very much like to play h4 and get these pawns on this dark squares. Basically, that is the best setup, best defensive setup that white can get, and that allows him to exchange pawns. So you can see whenever we push forward our pawns, he'll be able to exchange it, and basically that would be moving towards a draw, and that is exactly what we want to avoid. So knowing that white wants to play h4, now we have the power to stop it, and this is very important. You can see here, we knew that here we talked to ourselves, we asked ourselves what does white want, and we got to know that he wants to play g4, and we stopped it with playing h5, and that is something you need to always look out for. So after g3, what does white want to play? He wants to play h4. So now we know that. So let's stop it. Let's play h4 ourselves. The correct way to play now is to play the anti-positional g4, which weakens the f4 square and leaves behind the h3 pawn weakened forever. Basically, the white king will have to stay passive, protecting the pawn on h3, and white will be in a long torture. But that would have been still better to the continuation which white played here. White already under pressure, playing against an opponent which has a reputation of being invincible. So Capablanca at that point has a reputation of being invincible. He was undefeated. He remained undefeated for 10 years. Remember that he was just defeating players after players, Marshall and all of the players. He was just defeating one after the other. So he already had a very dangerous reputation. And here he captured, and his opponent basically blundered here and captured on h4. Now, generally, you might think what is wrong with this move, because don't we need to exchange pawns? It's actually a good idea. Yes, it's actually a good idea to exchange pawns, but this exchange leaves behind all these pawns and they are completely weak. Now they are isolated, they are weak, they are doubled, and they will soon fall off. So this is something you need to avoid. Structural damage is something of a serious concern. Basically, now if you go into a king and pawn endgame, if you just exchange rooks and go into a king and pawn endgame, this is a completely winning position for black. So All black needs to do here is capture this pawn and advance his king and go and try to exchange the rooks, and then go into a completely winning endgame. So how is it done? We take the pawn. Let's go step by step. King here. We don't advance our pawn. Obviously, passed pawns should be pushed. So we have a passed pawn. Let's push it forward. King to g3. Rook to d5. We keep our rook on a very good square. It cannot be harassed anymore. Rook to a5 attacks the pawn on e5. Let's protect it. And now he again puts his rook on the seventh rank. Now he's being clever. He's saying to us that you cannot go forward with your king, and you cannot get your king in the game. But Capablanca nevertheless finds a way to get his king in the game, and he plays king to g8, an excellent move. Now rook to b7, and the king obviously advances. So black has already made a lot of progress, whereas white is just shifting around his rook. So you can see our king is much better placed than it was few moves ago. Our rook is well placed. We have created a pawn chain which is much superior to these pawns. Obviously these pawns are very very weak. If he pushes, they will simply be captured or they will be isolated, and that will be a serious concern for him. So let's go forward. In this position, we just played our king to g6. He plays king rook to e7. And again, let us pause here. What does white want here? Does he have any plan? Can he play for f4? No, he cannot play for f4. We can just take that with the rook or with the pawn. Can he play for h4? Yes, he can play h4, but then again, that pawn on h4 would be very, very weak, and it can be soon attacked. So what can white do here? Basically, he doesn't have any good plans. So now let us ask the right questions. What does black want to do here? What does we want to do here? We have passed pawns, we want to push it. We would like to play f5 and e5. But what is the reason why can't we directly play f5? The reason is rook takes on e5. Now this is the problem. Knowing that, we already know the problem. So what is the solution for that problem? The solution is rook to d first rook to d3 check, and now rook to d5, protecting the pawn. Now this pawn is well supported, and now we can actually push forward with f5. So it's a conversation. Whenever you play a game of chess is a conversation. It's a trade of ideas, trade of logic. You need to ask yourself consistent question. That's what I do. That's what Capablanca does. I've read some books of Capablanca. He doesn't always calculate. He just makes a plan which is imaginative, or he just talks to himself, and that's how he gets his plan. You need to talk to yourself. You need to ask the right questions. So we asked ourselves, what is our plan? Our plan was to play f5 e4, and how is it possible? You need to protect the e5 pawn first, which we did, and now it's possible to push for f5. So let's go forward. King goes to g3, and we finally get f5. So we got what we wanted. Let's continue. Rook to a7, check. He just goes back. Obviously playing f3 is not really a great idea, because we can simply play e4 and win a pawn over here. That is the reason he cannot push his pawn. He has to go back, and again he's not making any progress. His rook just shifting over here and there, shifting on the 7th rank. His king just coming up and down the board does not make any difference, whereas us, we have definitely improved our position. So let's continue. E4. Now this is squeeze as we see in the games of Carlsen. Black is actually squeezing white. This pawn is now paralyzed. It cannot come forward. We can simply capture it. And even this pawn cannot come forward. We can play king at 6, wait around and just take the pawn at the right moment. So he plays rook to a4, and we continue to advance our king. Let's get the pawn in. And here we go. Black is consistently improving his position. Now he's threatening to play e3. So you can see Capablanca is playing very slowly, step by step. He's not taking any risk. He's not bursting out. He's playing very calmly, very coolly, and he's playing very good moves. So now e3 is a threat. E3 is a threat. How are we going to continue that? So let's see. Rook to a4 is played, basically pinning the pawn. Now that's the problem. We cannot push forward the pawn. So what's the solution of the problem? Well, we move the king. Now it's unpinned, and now we are actually threatening to push forward. Simple problem solved. Now king goes back, king f4, king g2, and g5. Again, you can see white not making any progress, standing his ground, whereas black is consistently making progress. So rook to b5, rook to b4, king to e5. Now this is a very important point. Normally, a player player of our caliber would simply play something like g4, which is actually a very very bad move. Trading your excellent pawn for a weak pawn on h3 is not a good idea. In fact, you should just keep those pawns the way it is and look for a very brilliant strategy. What is the way to win here again? Which pieces do you need, which pieces do you not need? If we go into an endgame, king and pawn endgame, this is completely winning for black. All we need to do now is exchange rooks. So if we can imagine both the rooks go off the board, if they are exchanged, now this is a completely winning endgame for black. All he needs to do is just bring his king and push forward his pawns. Simple as that, and then that creates a passed pawn. So what we need here is to exchange rooks. That's the plan. Let's go forward. King e5, he throws in a check. Do you exchange the rooks? He says no, not an issue, we just push forward. Rook to g8 attacks our pawn on g5. Not an issue, we just play king to d4. Our rook protects it, and now we are ready to push forward with e3 and create a passed pawn. So king goes to passivity. He's going back, and his quite miserably placed. So king to d3, rook to a8. Here we go, e3. We have successfully created a passed pawn. a3, this king moves around here, he takes, and here is an excellent move. Capablanca very coolly simply plays f3. Now the threat is obviously check on e2, check on d2, and then pushing forward the pawn, and basically white is simply paralyzed here. He cannot do anything. He moves his rook, we take the pawn on e3, and in general he's just going downhill. So king moves around, we just play rook to d3, saying to himself, do you want to exchange the pieces? That is something we would like to, we would very much like. If that happens, exchanging rooks takes us into a completely winning endgame. So he avoids the exchange, we take the pawn, thank you for the pawn, check, and all we need to do now is put a king on g3, and that will threaten all kind of checkmates. So what does he do here? Let's see. What was his last move? Okay, he just played rook to e8, and now rook to g8. Yeah, rook to g8 is what is played. Here we go. We throw in a check. We put the rook on the 7th rank. The king goes back, and finally rook to h2. Realizing that this pawn was a weakness, a target, we did not exchange it, and finally this is what happens. The pawn is a weakness. It remains a weakness, and now rook h2 is played. Something like rook h8 is not going to work because we simply push forward with g4. Taking is not possible. Pushing forward runs into g3, completely winning position, and that is the reason he plays king to g1. We just take the pawn, and all we have got here is a completely winning position, and this is the position where white resigned. Uh, Two connected passed pawns on the 6th rank, on the 5th rank, completely winning. All we have to do is throw in a check. King goes here, check over here, and next move will promote. That is completely winning again. So quite a beautiful and excellent game from Capablanca. Very technical. It was a very long game. I hope you bared with me. But yeah, very interesting. At the beginning of the game, he was worse. He was clearly worse. But he not only turned it around, he turned the tables, but he showed his excellent class. And every single time he made prophylactic moves, he made beautiful prophylactic moves and simply crushed his opponent. So brilliant endgame. It was a very long endgame. It was a game of 70 moves or something. And I hope you bared with me. Thank you for watching, and hope you have learned something out of this great endgame from the great chess machine Capablanca. Until next time, bye.